By the time I was 26, I owned a wedding ring with no husband to it, two children who looked to me for everything, and the certain knowledge that the people who should have kept us safe had decided we were no longer their concern. That was the autumn of 1886, in a high valley above the town of Greer's Hollow in the Colorado mountain country, where the aspens had already gone to copper and the first hard frost had laid a white skin over the water trough. My husband, Eli, had been 3 months under the ground of the family plot when his brother stood in the doorway of the house Eli built and told me the land was spoken for. He did not raise his voice. He had his hat in his hands, and he turned it round and round by the brim while he spoke, and he said it the way a man reads a figure off a ledger as if it were arithmetic, and not a sentence passed on a widow and two children. The deed had Eli's father's name on it, and the old man had signed it over to the living sons before the grave was filled, and I, being neither son nor blood, was a guest who had stayed past her welcome. I had until the week was out. I packed what was mine and a few things that were not quite, and I did not argue because I had learned by then that a person can be right and still be put out the door, and that the arguing only costs you the last of your dignity on the way through it. I want you to stay with me through what came after, because what I did next the whole town called madness, and I would ask you to judge it only at the end. I took my children, a chest of my father's tools, and a brown dog named Pell, and I walked up the valley toward a seam of rock everyone in Greer's Hollow had agreed was worthless. What none of them understood, and what I did not fully understand myself that first gray morning, was that worthless ground can hold the only warmth a person has left, if you know how to read it. My father had been a hard rock miner, and he died when I was 19 with no money to leave me and no land. What he left instead was a way of looking at stone. His name was Tobias, though the men who worked beside him called him Toby Penhale, and he had come over as a boy from a mining country across the sea, where his own father had gone down into the earth before him, so that the knowledge in his hands was already old when it reached me. He worked the deep workings in the Cornish fashion and carried in him 100 small certainties about how the earth behaves when you cut into it, which rock would hold and which would slough, which ground breathed water and which breathed air, how a candle flame leans toward a bad current and stands straight in a good one, so that a man could read the health of a working by watching a flame the way a sailor reads weather by watching a gull. He taught me these things not as lessons, but as the ordinary furniture of his talk, the way another father might teach a child the names of the trees. He used to take my hand and lay it flat against the wall of a drift and ask me what I felt. Cold, I would say, because I was a child and the rock was cold. Feel again, he would say, and he would wait, never hurrying me, until I learned that some stone breathed cold straight up from the deep, and some stone held a steadiness in it, a refusal to follow the weather above. That difference, he told me, was the difference between a place that would kill you in a winter and a place that would carry you through one. He told me the earth keeps its own season below a certain depth, that it does not care what the sky is doing, that a working cut into the right ground stays near the same warmth in January as in June. The mountains take their time about everything, he said, even the cold, and a man who learns to wait the way a mountain waits will outlast every storm that ever blew. I did not know then that I had been handed the one inheritance that would matter. I thought I had only lost my father, and for a long time after he was gone, I carried his sayings the way you carry a key to a house you no longer own, not knowing there was a door for it. Still waiting somewhere up the valley, there was an old prospect at it, cut into the shoulder of the mountain above the valley, driven years before by men who had chased a vein of silver into the rock and lost it. They had gone perhaps 80 feet in and struck nothing worth the powder, and they had walked away and left the hole behind them like a question no one wished to answer. The town called it the dry hole. Boys dared each other to step inside it and run out again before the dark could swallow them. Men spoke of it the way they spoke of a debt that had been forgiven, only because it could never be collected, a thing with no value that could not even be thrown away. When I told my husband's brother that I meant to live in it through the winter, he laughed, and his laugh was not cruel so much as comfortable. The laugh of a man who has never once in his life had to be wrong. A woman and two babes in a played-out silver hole, he said to the men on the store porch, and they passed it down the bench the way you pass a jug, each man taking his swallow of it and handing it on. By the next Sunday I had a name in that town. They called me the Whole Widow. Royce Tanner, who kept the store and had loaned my husband money against a hay crop that died with him, said it first and said it loudest, standing on his own porch with his thumbs in his vest. And a name said loud enough by the right man becomes a fact before the week is out. I heard children use it who could not have known what it meant. I heard it from women who brought me bread and pity in the same basket. I had reasons they could not see, and I had Pell, who did not care what anyone called me. The first thing I did was not build but watch. For 3 days I went up at dawn with the children bundled in the wagon and a tallow candle in my hand, and I put my hand to the back of that old working, the way my father had taught me, 80 feet in past the curve where the daylight gave out, and I felt what he had promised I would feel. The deep rock held steady. Outside, the frost cracked the puddles, and the wind came down off the peaks with teeth in it. But back in the dark of that hole, the air sat quiet, and even neither warm nor biting, the temperature of a root cellar that the seasons had forgotten. I held my candle up at the curve and watched the flame, and it stood straight and steady, the way my father said a flame stands in good air, leaning neither in nor out, which told me the old working breathed gently on its own, and would not smother us if I gave it a fire and a way for the smoke to climb. There was the strange thing my father had named for me years before, that the earth below a certain reach keeps near the same warmth the whole year through. I could not have given you the number then in the way a learned man would. I knew it the way you know a familiar face in a crowd before you have found the name to go with it. I knew it in my hand before I had the words for it, and the words came after, the way they always do. My daughter asked me once that autumn why I kept putting my hand to the wall, and I told her the truth that her grandfather had taught me. The rock could keep a person alive, and that I was only doing what his hands had taught mine. Feeling comes first, I told her, and the knowing comes after, but the feeling is the part you can trust. She was too small to understand it then. She understands it now, and there is a thing I want to set down plainly here, because it is the whole of why we lived when others did not. My father left me no money and no land and no name worth the having in that valley. What he left me was the inside of a mountain, though neither of us knew it at the time, a way of putting my hand to cold stone and knowing whether it would kill me or keep me. That is the only inheritance that cannot be signed away to a brother or read off a deed or burned in a frame house in a wind. It lives in the hand and it goes where the hand goes, and a person who has it is never quite as poor as they look standing in a doorway with everything they own in a chest. The work of making that hole a home took the better part of 2 months, and every day of it I was watched and counted out. The mouth of the Adit gaped wide and let the cold walk straight in, so the first thing was to close it down to a door a body could pass through and a small hearth could warm. I hauled stone from the spoil pile the old miners had left, the very rock they had broken for nothing, and I built a wall of it across the opening, dry laid and chinked, and then packed over with clay I dug from the creek bank and carried up in a barrow until my hands cracked and bled at the knuckles. I built it the way my father walled off a drift he meant to leave for a season, thick at the base and battered back, and I left only a narrow gap at one side, no wider than my own shoulders, that a person had to turn sideways and breathe out to slip through. The town made much of that gap. They said the whole widow had built herself a door too small to be a door. What they did not see was the reason. A wide mouth bleeds heat the way a torn sack bleeds grain. A narrow gap holds it. My father had told me that warm air is a patient thief and will leave by any opening you give it. So you give it none you do not need, and the one you keep small. The children learned to slip through it sideways and thought it a game. Pell learned it too and would wait at the gap with his nose to the crack until I let him in. Behind that gap, I made us a house, and I made it the way the deep workings are made, which is to say I respected the air. A closed hole with a fire in it is a grave, my father always said. And he had carried out men who learned that lesson too late, men who walled themselves in tight against the cold and woke to nothing because the bad air of their own fire had settled on them in the night like a hand over the mouth. So I drove a second small shaft, a chimney really, angled up through a seam of broken rock to the open air above, and the driving of it cost me 3 weeks of swinging a single jack against a drill I turned by hand, a quarter-inch at a stroke, the way my father had taught me to read the grain of the stone, and strike with it instead of against it. I set the hearth so the smoke drew up and out, and pulled clean air in behind it through a low vent I left near the floor of the gap, because warm, foul air rises and cold, clean air sinks, and if you let the one out the high way, it will pull the other in the low way without your asking. The fire breathed and we breathed, and the bad air went up the mountain and was gone. I tested it the way my father had taught me, with a candle held low and then high, watching the flame lean and stand, until I was certain the chamber drew its breath as cleanly as a sleeping child. And only then did I bring the children in to stay. I hung the walls with what I had, the quilts off our beds and the hides Eli had cured, and I floored the living chamber with split timber, laid over tamped earth, so the cold of the ground could not climb into us as we slept. For it is not the air alone that steals a person's warmth, but the ground beneath them, drinking it out through the soles of the feet all the long night. I built a sleeping shelf back where the rock held steadiest, and there I put the children, deepest in, where the mountain itself stood between them and the winter. Royce came up once on a Sunday with 2 other men to see the foolishness for himself, and he stood at my narrow gap and would not stoop to enter. And he told the men beside him that I had dug my children a tomb and would have them all frozen by Christmas. The whole widow, he said again, loud enough for me to hear it past the stone. I let it pass. Pell growled low in his chest, and I put my hand on his head, and he stopped. If you have ever been the joke a town tells itself in the evenings, you will know that the cruelest part is not the laughing. It is the kindness folded into it, the way people pity you to your face while they pass your name down the porch behind your back. I learned not to mind the porch. I had a vent that drew clean and a hearth that drew clean and 40 feet of mountain over my children's heads, and I had begun to understand the town could not, which was that the same rock they had written off as worthless was the warmest ground in the whole valley. A man named Carver came through that autumn, a surveyor working for the territory, mapping the old workings and the section lines, a lean, quiet man with ink stains on his fingers and a way of looking at a thing twice before he spoke of it once. He was the first soul in that country to look at what I had done and not laugh. He came up the trail with his chain and his transit and his book, and he asked could he step inside. And he turned himself sideways and slipped through my narrow gap, and he stood a long while in the warm dark of that chamber saying nothing, only turning his head slowly to take in the hearth and the vent and the angle of the chimney and the sleeping shelf set deep in the steady rock. Then he took out his book and began to write. He asked me how I knew to angle the chimney so it would draw. He asked me how I knew the depth to dig to before the rock went steady, and how I had judged the air safe before I ever lit a flame. I told him my father had taught me that he was a Cornish miner who had read stone the way other men read scripture, and that the only inheritance worth having is the kind that lives in your hands and cannot be taken by any brother or any deed. Carver wrote that down too, the whole of it, and read it back to me to be sure he had it right. He had the manner of a man storing something he meant to keep, and when he left, he shook my hand as he would have shaken a man's, which no one in that valley had done since Eli died. The signs of what was coming began in the last week of November, and like all the worst things, they came quietly, in a language only the old and the watchful still bothered to read. The cattle in the valley turned their tails to the north and stood that way for a whole day, packed close along the fence lines, which the old hands knew to read, and the young ones did not. The geese had gone over early and gone over high, in a hurry that geese do not show without a reason. The squirrels in the timber above my attic had been at their hoarding since the middle of October, weeks ahead of any ordinary autumn, and I had marked it and laid in more wood for the marking. There came a morning when the sky to the northwest was the color of a healing bruise, a yellow-gray that pressed down on the peaks and would not lift, and the air had a stillness in it that was not peace but the holding of a breath. The smoke from the town chimneys did not rise that morning, but laid down flat along the roofs and crept, which my father had taught me was the surest sign of all, that the weather was about to change its whole mind at once. Royce stopped me on the road into town that morning, the last time he would ever say it to my face, and he looked at my wagon piled high with split wood and my brown dog walking at the wheel, and he shook his head with that comfortable certainty of his, and he said the whole widow was hauling kindling up to her grave. He meant it as the same old joke. The men with him laughed, the same old laugh, easy and unbothered. Men who had warm stoves and full woodsheds, and no notion that the sheds would not be enough. I drove my wagon up the valley, and I did not answer, because I had felt the air, and I knew what the cattle knew, and I had a great deal of work to do before the sky opened. That night the first snow came down fine and dry as flour, hissing against the stone of my wall, and it did not stop. The storm that broke over the Colorado high country in the first days of December that year is still spoken of by those whose grandparents lived through it. The temperature fell past anything the valley had a memory of, down to 30 and then 40 below in the worst of the nights, a cold so deep that the green pine cracked like pistol shots in the timber, and the nails drew frost inside the walls of every frame house in the hollow. For 9 days the wind did not rest. The snow came not in the soft, heavy flakes of an ordinary winter, but in a dry, stinging powder driven sideways, and it drifted to the eaves of houses, and then above them, and a man who stepped out to his own barn could lose the line of his own fence in the white and never find his way back. Down in Greer's Hollow, the cold did its arithmetic with a terrible patience, and the arithmetic was this: the Vesper family, 4 of them in a frame house with green wood for fuel, burned their furniture the 3rd day, and their fence rails the 5th, and were found by neighbors huddled and failing. On the 7th, alive but only just, the 2 little ones too far gone with the chill to be left where they lay. Old Mr. Pruitt, who would not leave his stock, walked out to his barn on the 2nd night and did not come back. And they found him in the lee of the wall, with the lantern still in his hand and the wick long burned out. The Harmon house went through 1.25 cords of wood in 9 days, and still the frost stood thick on the inside of every window, and 2 of the Harmon children took a fever from the cold that their small bodies could not climb back out of. A frame house in a wind like that is a basket trying to hold water, and the whole town learned it together, burning everything that would burn, and watching the cold come through the walls anyway. And back in my hole, behind a narrow gap a man would not stoop to enter, my children slept warm. I want to tell you the truth of it plainly, because the truth was stranger than any boast. We did not suffer. The deep rock held its steady warmth as my father had promised it would, near 50 degrees of its own accord. Before ever I lit a fire, and my small hearth drawing clean through the vents lifted the chamber past 60 to where a child could sleep without a shiver in nothing but a nightshirt. I had hauled up 3 cords of split pine through the autumn while the town laughed at the hauling, and through all 9 days of that killing storm, I burned not one full cord of it. Down in the valley, families burned their chairs and their cradles and a cord and a half besides, and still woke to ice on their blankets. 40 feet inside a mountain, we lay in a warmth so even that my daughter complained of being too hot and kicked her quilt to the floor. And my son asked me why the wind sounded so angry. And I told him the wind was angry because it could not reach us, and he laughed and went back to sleep. Pell stretched out by the hearth and slept like a dog with nothing in the world to trouble him. I sat up the worst of those nights, with my hand on the rock, listening to the wind howl itself hoarse against the mountain that did not feel it, and I thought of my father, and I was not afraid. The mountain had its own season, and we were living in it. On the 6th day, the wind eased enough that a man could move, and that was the day they came up the valley. I heard Pell rise and go to the gap before I heard anything else, his ears up and his body still, the way a dog stands when something is coming that he has not decided about. Then I heard the crunch of snow under boots that were nearly spent, the slow, heavy tread of men who had walked a long way at the end of their strength, and a voice calling, hoarse and cracked, asking was anyone living. I went out through the gap, and there, in the white stood Royce Tanner and 3 men from the town, and behind them on a hand sled, they were dragging the 2 youngest Vesper children, wrapped in everything the families had left to wrap them in. Royce's face was raw and gray, and there was frost crusted in his beard, and his eyes, when they found mine, were not the eyes of a man telling a joke on a store porch. They had walked up the valley because someone in the last extremity had remembered that the whole widow had hauled a winter's wood into the warmest ground in the country, and they had come not to mock but to beg shelter for children who would not last another night below. I did not make them ask. I did not make them stand in the cold and find the words. I stood aside from the narrow gap, and I told them to bring the children in. He stooped to enter. That was the thing I have never forgotten, the sight of Royce Tanner turning himself sideways and bowing his head to pass. Through the small door he had laughed at, the door he had called too small to be a door, into the warm dark he had named a tomb. He came into that chamber out of a cold that was killing the valley, and he felt the even warmth of the deep rock come up around him like water, closing over a swimmer, and he saw my 2 children sleeping easy on their shelf, and the Vesper little ones already coming back to color by my hearth, their gray cheeks warming to pink as the fire and the mountain worked on them together. He stood there in the firelight with the snow melting off his coat and running in dark threads to the timber floor, and he could not speak. The other men crowded in behind him through the gap and went quiet the same way, taking off their hats without seeming to know they did it. For a long moment there was no sound but the fire drawing clean up the chimney and the wind far off against the stone, the wind that could not get in. Then Royce looked at the rock over his head, and at the fire, and at the sleeping children, and he took off his frozen hat, and he said one thing. "You knew," he said. "That was all. You knew." And I told him to sit down by the fire and get warm, because there was room, and because a person who has come to you out of the cold is no longer your enemy, whatever they called you in the summer. He sat. He put his raw hands toward the fire, and he wept a little, quietly, the way a hardman weeps when he has been wrong about something that nearly cost children their lives, and no one in that warm chamber thought the less of him for it, least of all me. We sheltered 11 souls in that hole, before the storm let go, 11 where there had been 3, and not one of them took any harm past the chill they carried in with them. The Vesper children mended on my hearth, and by the second day they were underfoot and laughing. And their mother, when she was strong enough to climb the valley and fetch them, stood at my gap and could not look at me for the shame and the gratitude warring in her face. I told her there was nothing to carry between us but the children, and to take them home well, and she did. The men slept in shifts on my timber floor and ate from my stores the salt pork and the dried beans and the apples I had laid by, while they laughed at the laying by, and I did not count any of it against them, then or after. There is a kind of accounting that the cold does for you if you let it, and I had decided up at that gap. The first morning I felt the steady rock, that I would keep no other ledger than the one the mountain kept. A woman who has been put out of one house learns the worth of being let into another, and I would not be the kind to weigh out warmth by the spoonful to people who had come to me freezing, whatever they had called me on the porch in the easy months. Royce sat by my fire those last days of the storm, and he watched me move about the chamber, banking the coals and turning the children. And once he said, lo, that he had been a fool. And I told him a man who comes a long way through a killing cold to save children is not even kin to, has earned the right to leave his foolishness at the door. He did not answer that. He only nodded the way a man nods when something has gone all the way down in him and found the bottom. When at last the sky cleared and the cold broke, and the valley dug itself out from under a winter it would never forget, the town that came down off my mountain was not the same town that had named me a fool. They had felt the thing with their own bodies. They had passed through the narrow gap that a grown man had to bow to enter, and they had lived because of it, and you cannot laugh for long at a door that saved your life and the lives of your children. Royce Tanner walked down ahead of the others, and he did not say much, for he was not a man easy with words once the wrong ones had been taken from him. But a week later a load of cut hardwood appeared at the mouth of my adit, oak and ash split fine and stacked square, and then another load the week after, and no one ever told me who sent them, which was how I knew exactly who had. In the spring, the surveyor Carver came back, and he brought others, and the thing my father had taught me began to travel. Carver had written it all in his book, through the autumn, the depth to the steady rock, the angle of the chimney, the narrow gap that held the heat, the low vent that fed the fire clean, and he understood, as few do, that it was not the whole that mattered but the knowing behind it. He had drawn it out fair in his careful hand and shown it to men in the territory office, and word came back up the valley that the widow's folly had been a sound thing all along, which the valley already knew, having felt it in their own bones. Men came that summer and the summers after to cut shelters into the warm ground of those mountains, and the ones who copied only the shape of what I had done, who dug a hole and slapped a wall across it and called it finished, learned that a hole is just a hole without the air drawn right and the depth read true. One man drove a shelter too shallow and woke each morning as cold as if he had slept in the open, because he had not gone deep enough to reach the steady rock and only thought he had. Another sealed his tight against the wind with no vent at all, and was lucky to be pulled out senseless by a neighbor before the bad air took him for good. The ones who came and asked and listened, who put their hand to the rock and learned to feel what it held before they ever swung a pick, those ones built places that carried their families through every hard winter after. The knowledge spread the way water spreads, finding the low places, filling what would hold it, and running off what would not. Within a few years, there were a dozen such shelters in that country, and they had stopped calling them the whole widow's folly. They called them earth-warmed, or they called them by my father's old Cornish word for a working that keeps its season and the name that had been a joke became a thing a man said with respect, and then with a kind of pride, as though the valley had thought of it itself. I lived a long life in that valley, and a good one, and I raised my children in the warm heart of a mountain that the whole town had once agreed was worthless. My daughter learned to read the rock with her hand, the way I had learned it from my father, and he from his, putting her small palm to the wall when she was no taller than the sleeping shelf. And she taught it to her own children in turn, so that the knowledge ran on down the years like a fire passed lamp to lamp, never the same flame and always the same light. My son went off to the deep mines a grown man and came back a captain of them, and he was known the length of that range as a man who would not send another down into air he had not read himself, which was his grandfather speaking through him, though the two never met in this life. Pell lived out his days by that hearth, gray at the muzzle and slow on the cold mornings, and he is buried on the slope above the gap where the first sun touches in the morning, and I have never passed the spot without a word for him. Royce Tanner became in the end the staunchest friend I had in that country, and when he was an old man he would tell newcomers the story of the winter the whole widow saved the valley, and he told it against himself, which is the only honest way a man can tell such a story. I never took a thing from him for the saying of it, nor asked an apology, for the cold had settled the account I never meant to settle, and there is no profit in carrying a grudge into a warm room. He is gone now, these many years, and most of the rest of them with him, and the town remembers the storm the way towns remember such things, as something that happened to all of them together rather than something one woman in a hole had seen coming. I am an old woman now, and the aid it still holds. I went up to it last week on my granddaughter's arm, slow as the season turns, the same slope I once climbed at a run with a barrow of clay, and we stood at the narrow gap my father's sought knowledge taught my hands to build. The valley below has changed in 50 years, the frame houses giving way to better built ones, the road widened, the town grown up around the bones of the old store where a man once said, "My name to make other men laugh." The mountains have not changed at all. They keep their season the way they always have, patient past any human grudge or memory, and the door cut small into their shoulder keeps it with them. I put my palm flat against the rock the way my father taught me when I was a child too, small to know what I was being given. The stone was warm. It is always warm, summer and winter both, near 50 degrees of steady earth that does not care what the sky is doing, the way my father said it would be when he laid my small hand against the wall of a drift and told me to feel again. My granddaughter put her hand beside mine on the stone, and she felt it, and she did not need me to tell her what it meant. The wind comes down off the peaks the way it always has, and the snow lies deep in its season, and far up on the shoulder of that mountain there is a door cut small into worthless ground, and behind it the warmth holds, and the warmth holds, and it has not gone cold in 50 years.